I'm used to being the bad guy in the room. You can imagine when you're sitting at the STC and there are the ship owners representing the workers and all the governments, and then there's the industry representative, and guess who's the bad one? And I wanted to tell you a little bit about our experiences there. The second experience, which is nice and very different to usually. Normally, Beatrice has to sit there and listen to us. It was actually the first time I really heard Beatrice speak about all of this in years since we know each other. So very different roles here. I wanted to give you a little impression how, in a very abstract way, and I tried to show you with a few practical examples, how much we enjoy here in Geneva, in particular under the roof of the ILO, what multilateralism means. A very abstract word normally. People say multilateralism is something vaguely positive, and then there are the populists who are against it, and that remains typically, well, somewhat cloudy. And here under the roof of the ILO, we really can understand what that means in practice, very basically, and how that eventually trickles down to the seafarers, and very often experiences you actually have with seafarers that, as you said, they can actually practically refer to the MLC, and there is actually something that eventually and hopefully very often works. And we were lucky enough to have this experience here at the ILO. As ship owners, we really come from, if I may say, kind of from the bad side. We ship owning and operating ships over the last 100 years has changed quite profoundly. Behind the screens you see still an old vessel from the 1950s, and so you know, maybe through family stories or through experience, through other stories, how seafarers have been treated, and there was actually very, very good reasons why seafarers actually needed support from the convention since 1919. It didn't come out of the void. Seafarers, absolutely, they were somewhat working in an unregulated space, and that was vastly exploited, of course. And I think with hindsight, and since now some generations past, we can be, I think, fairly candid about it. These conventions and the support for the seafarers was desperately needed, and there was very good reason that this organization, the ILO, a lot of the activities of the ILO were actually focused on the seafarers. And maybe if you look on the wider context here in Geneva, when the League of Nations was here, everything failed except the ILO. And quite a bit moved to New York, but the ILO stayed here with a few other organizations, and a pillar here was the seafarers, because what the ILO did had actually practical application. The view on what had been done here at the ILO for seafarers, I think, has changed also over the last few decades. There was, for most in the room, is our work experience. When ship owners also started to recognize that this is not only the other side sitting there and always the seafarers winning their argument, and this is a very leftist organization which is very unhelpful. This is kind of the view of the 70s, 80s and 90s still, from the employer side. Within the ship owners, the views started to shift maybe somewhere in the 1990s, that actually this can become also a very helpful tool for the employer side. If there's a level playing field, which Beatrice mentioned already, then if you belong to the hopefully large family of the good ship owners, that actually raises those at the bottom, which are competing against you by actually mistreating seafarers, by not paying them enough, by not giving them enough of the rights that should be granted to them. So I think there was a recognition slowly among ship owners that this could be helpful. This, of course, is easier to recognize on an organizational level within ship owners' organizations. Ship owners themselves were, to put it carefully, more hesitant here in the recognition process. weren't always that happy. And I know from the organization I worked for quite some time, the German ship owners, there were a few very progressive ship owners who supported also bringing the MLC together. And there was a majority which, and referring to what you said from the CEO office, which luckily didn't entirely understand what was going on there. And once they did understand, they were utterly unhappy about it, but then it was too late. And maybe to also give you a practical, why don't still today many in the upper hierarchies of some shipping companies don't really know about the social stuff here? Very often it ends up, or it almost always ends up late on the agenda of any meeting, of any board meeting. You start in legal affairs, then you have technical affairs, then you have a bit others, and then it's the social stuff, and that in most cases falls off the agenda because it's too late. And then, yeah, we distribute the notes, and then you will see it. And so nobody understands what's going on there, which I think in the emergence of the MLC was a blessing. If all ship owners at all times had understood what was happening there, I think we wouldn't have the MLC today. Now we do have it, and now I think the recognition process is actually quite helpful. There was one pivotal moment for our social partnership, and I think that was COVID. And one of the extremely positive lessons of COVID was also that the social partnership between the unions, so the workers in our case, as the terminology in the RLO is, so the seafarers and the ship owners have grown very, very much together within those years of the pandemic. And very practically, and there was actually Beatrice with her colleagues, they called, normally we met like at best twice a year over the phone. All of a sudden we met at least once a week, and sometimes it felt like daily meetings, and sometimes it was actually daily meetings, because under COVID there were so urgent matters about the seafarers that had to be solved. And then you may have an abstract organization, and then you have people. And what we discovered here, ILO is not this huge, comparatively ugly building, which is a very friendly photograph here, where the best thing is actually the view to the outside. But it's actually people in there who care about what they do. And they forced us together a few times a week and trying to solve problems, real problems. Not abstract problems, not rewriting a convention, but getting seafarers off the ship, getting a body off the ship, that was for my German constituency at the time, one of the most pressing problems, getting seafarers from the Pacific Islands, from Kiribati, home. They couldn't get home for 2 years because the country refused to let them in. So we had to do something with these seafarers. And these were very practical problems, and all of a sudden the United Nations, which normally is nothing you can touch, nothing you can really pinpoint your fingers at, had a face and did something very practical, very tangible, very real. There was one, I wouldn't call it a discovery, but a great lesson, a very practical one, a great one, which a lot of, also on our side, employers felt and understood that. What we also saw, and I think what both sides, the unions and the employer side said, we actually have absolutely identical interests in times of crisis. There was no difference. There was whatever issues were raised, they were the same from the unions and the employers. We just wanted to get seafarers home. We wanted to get fresh seafarers who didn't get paid if they didn't work on board. We wanted safety, we wanted them to be healthy, and there was actually absolutely no difference, which was extremely helpful. Another rather unhelpful discovery, and this is what some of the amendments now are about and what we more or less directly are addressing next April, is that governments in numerous instances, have proved extremely unhelpful. And you may say, well, it's great that you discover a common enemy. Well, under this roof of the ILO, we can't say, none of these three partners are really an enemy, and the governments are fairly important in this process. So, however, in the pandemic, voluntarily and sometimes involuntarily, and Beatrice related to that already, we have the MLC, and if everything's fine, everything's great, then the Ministry of Transport or whoever's taking care of it understands what's happening. Under COVID, all of a sudden, very different ministries were much more important. The ministries of the Interior, the Health Ministry, and a few others. And most of them had never ever heard of the MLC. And they said, no, seafarers, we can't have seafarers now messing around in our ports here. Leave them on board. And MLC, whatever that is, keep that on the bookshelf. We have more important things to deal with. And that was the response we very often got. And that was a difficult thing to get through. One of the very positive results, again, and wouldn't have happened without people like Beatrice, we ended up having, even in the United Nations General Assembly, a resolution on seafarers. So all of this wouldn't have happened. We never had that before. The General Assembly of the United Nations never talked about seafarers before in that respect. Eventually it did. Did it change anything? No. But it set a precedent. There is a text now, something we can refer to, something we can work with, and that'll eventually trickle down. One of the amendments, there was, I think, like 3-point letters here, which will be most likely on the table next April, will be around the terminology of essential workers. There was a term, key workers or essential workers, very much used in the pandemic, where we try to promote that seafarers were treated differently to other people like tourists and so. So just to get them through airports, etc. And somehow we have to perpetuate that terminology and the use of that term and somehow invent what it actually means. We implemented this terminology, everybody got very excited about it, seafarers are key workers, and well, what does it actually mean? Nobody knows yet. But that is something we have to create, and that is also one of the nice things about international organizations. They are not set in stone. What we do there, what we write there, is actually a process of creation. If we want to treat seafarers in the next decades differently to how we treated them before, then sometimes we have to create something like terminology. They are essential workers. And then, as Beatrice described, of course, once we put that in the convention, then it has to trickle down to national law, then it has to trickle down to local, to the ports, then it has to trickle down to the ministries of the Interior, and then we have to see what it gives. We don't always know exactly what the outcome is, but we know that something has to happen. And that's what we will try again next year. One of the outcomes, which is still also slightly cloudy maybe, is that together with the seafarer side, with the unions, we talk quite a lot about just transition, which actually has nothing to do with COVID, but has a lot to do with the transition we are in the industry. And that is built on the trust that was created during COVID. When not only organizationally, but also a lot of real ship owners discovered that you can actually have serious conversations with the unions, and they have a serious interest in the seafarers that the unions represent and the ship owners employ. That was the building ground to talk about the possibility of create just transition, just as an outlook where we now jointly talk about how do we train and retrain and reskill seafarers that may have had their basic training 20 years ago, and they may have to work on more automated, more digitalized, more green ships in the future. it doesn't come automatically to you. You have to be retrained somehow, and this is one of the discussion grounds we have. And this, after all, this is again one of the very practical results from multilateralism. We understood that we can actually work together internationally, and then we have something very practical which will have direct effects on the operation of vessels. My PowerPoint slides are slightly less organized than Beatrice's. What's important for us in the future? First of all, what we have here is extremely precious. We really, really appreciate the MLC, and what Stuart and I, in our roles in our group, and then what we try to transport into the SDC and the discussions around the ALO. There is a danger, a very practical danger, that the MLC is watered down by too many amendments. The MLC, well, you said, well, it's a long document, yes, but for what it contains, it's an extremely short and concise document for the time being. If we amend it too often, too much, it gets bigger and bigger and more complicated, and that will probably strongly devalue it. We have to keep it short and crisp and readable. If it starts not to be readable, if we need lawyers to explain to us what's in the MLC, it becomes useless. And we need to avoid that. So it has to be ideally understandable for a seafarer. And if that's not the case, we are missing a point. So that's very important. Part of that is that we absolutely have to avoid amendments which are nonsense. And unfortunately we had those. If amendments are being proposed just because you have to do something for your constituency and because it sounds good, we are destroying the seriousness of what we actually have here. We need evidence that something is not working properly. And you brought the example of shore leave. It certainly didn't work properly and very often still doesn't. We need to do something about it. No matter what's currently in the text, obviously the text needs to be amended. That's very clear evidence, and I think all of you have examples of that. We had, and I give you an example which we got, Stuart and I got very passionate about, the amendment, and you mentioned it already, piracy. Complicated, and we discussed it for ages, and the evidence was exactly zero. It sounded great. We need to pay seafarers when they are held captive. Those who proposed this amendment had not a single case where a seafarer didn't get paid while he or she was held captive. So, and that is what we have to avoid, and that absolutely needs to be avoided. Once you get into the MLC, you can invent hundreds of amendments which you may think make use. But what we want is amendments that really come from basically from the seafarers. What do seafarers need? Not what we can invent or what lawyers can think of. There's lots of stuff. There's lots of streamlining that could be done around the MLC. There are probably 50, 60 amendments you can think of where the MLC is not entirely logical, where some things are, the same thing is referred to in 2 or 3 different places, yes. But as long as it works, fine. Don't amend it. Amend it in points where we need it. And that's what we want, and this is where we occasionally have still quite an argument with the unions, to put it mildly, where in general very often we now tend to agree. And also, we also had a sad story of a major study by an academic institution which tried to tell us that there is a huge problem, and for the global seafarers, and they had a study which I think was based on, I don't know, 12 interviews or so with seafarers. That is really devaluing the level of discussion we are supposed to have. So that's what we want to. Maybe to give you a little foretaste and then I'm done. Where we're looking into, Beatrice mentioned we have this meeting IMO and ILO. We are very good in acronyms. About violence harassment. There is a major convention from 2 years ago or so on the ILO about violence harassment. Is C190, how we are referring to it. So the convention number 190, which deals with violence harassment, and that is also an interesting case. Legally, it would now be very nice just to refer to that convention where violence and harassment is being dealt with, basically. We try to get that also for seafarers somehow. And now the question is, how do we do that best? We will have some proposals on that. That is a very generally uncontroversial discussion next time in April, so we want reference to that. But the question is how? Do we basically copy and paste it all and make MLC much, much longer and copy another convention into it, which is typically and I don't mean it negatively, it's typically the view of the unions who say, well, it all needs to be in there. And our view is typically just make a footnote and a reference and say, we basically make reference to it and we take it over. And we will meet somewhere in the middle probably. But I'm sure we will meet, so that's not difficult. What's very dear to our heart is the repatriation issue, so that the Kiribati case or other cases will not repeat themselves. And here, it's definitely unions and ship owners against governments, probably. And we, hopefully not so strongly, but here we need governments to take responsibility. And it's ship owners take their responsibility. We pay for repatriation. There's nothing against it. It's clearly regulated what we have to do, and it's all fine. But seafarers have to have the chance to leave the ship. Always, not occasionally or whenever the port just feels like it. And here governments have to take their responsibility, and here we have to make a major step forward. That'll be very, very important. I think those and something similar accounts for shore leave, of course, which is also very important for us. And then we will have some talk about the terminology, key workers, essential workers, and so, and a few others. And there are, we also know quite a few proposals floating around. Next Monday or so is the deadline, so we're all very nervous. We just had a lengthy meeting yesterday about it on our side, and so we're just trying to prepare the text. It's a little bit like in school or university when you have to hand in your papers. And so our professors then judging on them. And then we get them back and we assess them and we will discuss them next April. But as a general message, we are utterly happy that we have this roof to convene under here in Geneva at the RO. We have changed our view on what's actually going on there. We think the governments should fairly dramatically change their view on that and better understand what's going on there. And we're very much looking forward to work there. Thank you.